A quiet drive home. Rayan Turner, a seasoned soldier with a chest full of medals, but a heart full of uncertainty, gripped the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck as it hummed along the narrow country roads of his hometown. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting an amber glow across the endless stretch of fields and the occasional rundown barn. The air smelled of damp earth and impending rain, a scent he once associated with home. But today, it felt foreign, almost mocking. It had been 6 years since Rayan had last driven these roads, and they were much the same. Yet, the man behind the wheel had changed irrevocably. The years had etched worry lines onto his once youthful face. His hands bore calluses earned in foreign deserts, and his heart carried wounds that even time couldn't heal. Today, he was returning to Cedar Ridge, not as the proud, optimistic man he once was, but as a father desperately hoping to reclaim what was left of his fractured family. His truck groaned as it hit a pothole, jolting Rayan out of his reverie. His thoughts turned to his daughter, Grace. The last time he'd seen her, she was a lively 6-year-old with curls that danced when she laughed and a boundless energy that could light up any room. Now, she was 12. 6 long years had passed, filled with grainy video calls and hastily written letters. He often replayed their last moment together. A tearful goodbye at the base, Grace clutching his uniform as though her tiny hands could tether him to her side. "Promise you'll come back, Daddy," she'd whispered. "Always," he had said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. But promises had a way of becoming casualties of circumstance. His deployment had stretched into years, his marriage to Laura had crumbled under the weight of separation, and the courts, swayed by Laura's narrative of his absence, had awarded her full custody of Grace. Rayan had been relegated to the role of a visitor in his own daughter's life, a distant figure reduced to postcards and missed birthdays. As he neared Cedar Ridge, the familiar town sign came into view, its cheery slogan, "Where family comes first," mocking him with its irony. He slowed the truck as he approached the old Millard farm. The weathered barn still stood defiant against the elements, but the once vivid red paint had faded to a tired rust. Memories of simpler times surfaced, bonfires with Laura, teaching Grace to ride her first pony. Those memories felt like echoes from another lifetime. Finally, his old house came into view. It stood at the end of a gravel driveway, nestled among oak trees that whispered in the wind. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. This was where he'd built a life, where he'd imagined growing old with Laura and watching Grace flourish. Now, it was just a hollow shell of what it once was. Rayan parked the truck and turned off the engine, letting the silence engulf him. He sat there for a moment, staring at the house, summoning the courage to face the ghosts that lingered within. He had returned, but he wasn't sure if he belonged. Pushing open the truck door, he stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was cooler here, laced with the scent of pine and nostalgia. He grabbed his duffel bag from the back of the truck and approached the front door. His key turned smoothly in the lock, a small mercy he hadn't expected. The house greeted him with an eerie stillness. Dust motes floated lazily in the slanted sunlight, and the faint smell of disuse lingered in the air. The living room was just as he'd left it, yet it felt foreign. The couch where Grace had once sprawled with her storybooks was still there, but her laughter was missing. The walls were adorned with photos that told the story of a family that no longer existed, a picture of their wedding day, Grace's first birthday, a family trip to the beach. Rayan's gaze lingered on one photo of Grace in her soccer uniform, her smile wide and gap-toothed. That was the Grace he remembered. He wandered into the kitchen, where time seemed to have frozen. The fridge still bore Grace's drawings, held up by faded magnets. One caught his eye, a crayon drawing of a soldier holding hands with a little girl. "Daddy and Me" was scrawled in wobbly handwriting at the top. Rayan traced the drawing with his fingers, the weight of regret pressing down on him. He had promised her so much, and yet he had delivered so little. Dropping his duffel bag in the hallway, he made his way to the room that had once been Grace's. Opening the door, he was met with a wave of emotion. The bed was unmade, and the shelves were lined with dusty trophies and stuffed animals. A book lay open on the floor, its pages yellowed with time. It felt as though Grace had just stepped out for a moment, though he knew she hadn't been here in years. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly. He thought about the months ahead, the legal battle he was about to reignite. Laura had made it clear that she thought Grace was better off without him, but Ryan knew better. He'd seen the cracks in their video calls, heard the hesitation in Grace's voice when she talked about her life. He couldn't let her slip away, not this time. Pulling out his phone, he dialed Laura's number. The line rang and rang, each tone ratcheting up his anxiety. Finally, it went to voicemail. He hung up, not trusting himself to leave a message that wouldn't reveal his growing frustration. Instead, he sat there, staring at the empty room, the weight of 6 years of missed moments pressing down on him. For Grace, he would fight. For Grace, he would rebuild. He had come home, and he wasn't leaving without his daughter. The unseen scars. Ryan awoke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the windows of his old house. The sounds of chirping birds outside felt foreign, their melodies almost intrusive in the suffocating quiet of the home. It had been years since he had woken up here, and everything felt eerily untouched, as though time itself had paused in his absence. He rubbed his face and sat up on the couch where he had spent the night, a thin blanket tangled around his legs. Sleep had been elusive, his mind a battleground of memories and anxieties about what lay ahead. He glanced at his phone. It was early, but he needed to act. Today wasn't just another day. It was the first step in reclaiming his role as Grace's father. Ryan had spent the hours before dawn preparing himself mentally for what was to come. He knew Laura wasn't going to make this easy. Over the years, their conversations had devolved into terse exchanges facilitated by lawyers, each more distant and transactional than the last. She had made her feelings about him abundantly clear. Ryan was a ghost from her past, someone she had moved on from with startling efficiency. But Grace was the reason he had come back. She was the thread tying him to a life that felt increasingly out of reach, and he couldn't let that thread fray any further. Ryan grabbed his jacket and keys, pausing briefly in the hallway where a small mirror hung on the wall. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. His hair was peppered with gray, and his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights and countless regrets. With a deep breath, he turned away and stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting against his skin as he climbed into his truck. The drive to Laura's house felt interminable. Memories of their life together flooded his mind with every familiar landmark he passed. The diner where they had their first date, the park where they had picnicked on lazy summer afternoons, the church where they had exchanged vows. All of it felt like fragments of a dream he could barely recall. When he finally arrived at her home, his hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared at the modest 2-story house. It was well kept, with neatly trimmed hedges and a colorful garden that hinted at Laura's new life. Ryan took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped out of the truck. The crunch of gravel under his boots was the only sound as he approached the front door. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. For a moment, there was no response, and he wondered if Laura was even home. Just as he raised his hand to knock again, the door opened, revealing Laura. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her face framed by faint lines that hadn't been there before. She stared at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before her expression hardened. "Ryan," she said, her tone guarded, "what are you doing here?" "I need to see Grace," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's been too long." Laura crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You can't just show up unannounced and demand to see her. That's not how this works." Ryan clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I've been trying to contact you for weeks, Laura. You've ignored every call, every message. I'm done waiting." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he saw a flash of the woman he had once loved, the fiery determination that had drawn him to her. "We have a schedule, Ryan. You know that. You can't just barge in and disrupt everything." He stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't about schedules or rules. This is about Grace. I know she's been struggling, and I know you've been keeping things from me." Laura's expression faltered, a brief flicker of guilt crossing her face before she straightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Grace is fine." "She's not fine," Ryan shot back, his voice rising. "I've seen it in her eyes every time we talk. She's not the same little girl I left behind, and I need to know why." Laura hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, Ryan thought she might open up, but when she looked back up at him, her expression was cold. "You left, Brian. You chose your career over your family. Don't come back now and act like you have the right to judge me." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he refused to back down. "I didn't choose to leave, Laura. I was serving my country, doing what I thought was right for us, for Grace. And now, I'm trying to make things right. But I can't do that if you keep shutting me out." They stood there in tense silence, the weight of years of resentment hanging between them. Finally, Laura sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Ryan entered the house, his gaze sweeping over the familiar yet alien surroundings. The living room was immaculate, every piece of furniture carefully arranged, every surface spotless. It felt sterile, lacking the warmth and chaos that had once defined their home. "Wait here," Laura said, disappearing down the hallway. Ryan stood awkwardly in the living room, his eyes drawn to the photos on the mantel. Most of them were of Grace, her smile radiant, but tinged with a subtle sadness he hadn't noticed before. Among them were photos of Laura with a man Ryan didn't recognize, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with an easy smile. His stomach twisted as he realized this was the man who had replaced him in Grace's life. Before he could dwell on the thought, the sound of footsteps drew his attention. Grace appeared at the end of the hallway, her gaze hesitant as she clutched a stuffed animal to her chest. She had grown taller, her features more mature, but there was a fragility in her eyes that made Ryan's heart ache. "Dad?" she said softly, her voice uncertain. Ryan's throat tightened, and he forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart." Grace hesitated for a moment before rushing into his arms, the stuffed animal forgotten on the floor. Ryan held her tightly, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She felt so small, so vulnerable, and he couldn't shake the sense that she had been carrying more than any child should have to bear. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "I missed you too, Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." As he held her, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever battles he had to fight, he would protect her. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for the road ahead. For Grace, he would give everything. Grace's silent struggles. Ryan couldn't help but watch Grace closely as they sat across from one another in the old diner on Main Street. She had always loved this place as a little girl, her face lighting up at the thought of a stack of blueberry pancakes drowning in syrup. Now, at 12, she seemed smaller, quieter, her spark dimmed. It wasn't just her frame, though she was visibly thin. It was her demeanor. She moved cautiously, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though carrying a weight she was too young to bear. The waitress placed their plates on the table with a cheerful smile, but Grace barely glanced up. She picked at her food, avoiding Ryan's gaze. He tried to mask his worry as he cut into his own pancakes, hoping to coax her into conversation. "Still your favorite, huh?" he said, nodding toward her plate. "They even added extra blueberries for you." She looked up briefly, managing a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I guess," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the diner. Ryan set his fork down, his appetite fading. He had spent years imagining this moment, sitting with Grace, catching up on everything he had missed. But the reality was far more complicated. He wasn't just reconnecting with his daughter. He was trying to understand the scars she carried, the ones she couldn't or wouldn't put into words. "You know," he began, keeping his tone light, I've been dreaming about this. Just us, sitting here, talking. It feels good to finally have you with me, Grace." Her hand still on her fork, and she looked up at him. For a moment, her mask slipped, and he saw a flash of something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. "I missed you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. I thought maybe you wouldn't come back." Ryan's heart ached at her words. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his own. "I'll always come back for you," he said firmly. "I'm sorry it took me so long, but I'm here now, Grace, and I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, but her gaze drifted back to her plate. "Mom said you were busy with important stuff," she murmured. She said maybe it was better if I didn't bother you." Ryan's chest tightened, anger simmering just below the surface. He forced himself to stay calm, knowing that his frustration with Laura wasn't something Grace needed to carry. "You could never bother me," he said gently. "You're the most important person in my life, Grace. Always have been." Her lips quivered, and for a moment, Ryan thought she might cry. But she quickly blinked back her tears and resumed picking at her food. He let the silence linger, giving her space. Pushing too hard wouldn't help, but he couldn't ignore the weight she was carrying. After a while, she set her fork down and looked at him. "Dad, can I tell you something?" "Of course," he said, leaning in. "You can tell me anything." She hesitated, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. Sometimes it felt like I wasn't wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At home, I mean. Mom and Mark, they always seemed busy with each other. And Tommy, he'd say things like, 'I'm just in the way.'" Ryan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Grace was like a punch to the gut. "That's not true," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "You're not in the way, Grace. You're never in the way." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "But sometimes, it felt like maybe I was, like maybe they'd be happier without me." Ryan's heart broke at her words. He reached across the table, taking both of her hands in his. "Grace, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "What they said or did, none of that was your fault. You're not a burden, and you're not in the way. You're my daughter, and you're amazing. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than that." Her lip quivered, and this time, she didn't try to hide her tears. They spilled down her cheeks as she clung to his hands. "I just wanted someone to notice me," she said, her voice breaking. "To care." Ryan stood and moved to her side of the booth, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing quietly as he held her. "I care," he said softly. "I care more than anything, Grace. And I'm here now. I'm here for you." They sat like that for a long time, Grace's quiet sobs gradually subsiding. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy, but there was a small flicker of relief in her eyes. Ryan handed her a napkin, and she wiped her face, offering him a tentative smile. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice still shaky but steadier than before. "Anytime, sweetheart," he said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "That's what I'm here for." As they finished their meal, Ryan's mind raced with plans. He needed to do more than just comfort Grace. He needed to protect her. The neglect and emotional abuse she had endured were unacceptable, and he wasn't going to let it continue. When they left the diner, he decided to make a stop at the park. It had been one of Grace's favorite places when she was younger, and he hoped it might help her feel a little more like herself. They walked along the path, the crisp autumn air brushing against their faces. Grace seemed lighter, her steps less hesitant, as she took in the familiar sights. "Remember when we used to come here and feed the ducks?" Ryan asked, smiling as they approached the pond. Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I used to name them all," she said, "even though you told me I couldn't tell them apart." Ryan chuckled. "You were determined. I think one of them was named Quackers, right? She laughed, the sound soft but genuine. Yeah, and there was Ducky McDuckface. He laughed with her, the sound filling the cool air. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a glimpse of the Grace he remembered, the bright, spirited girl who had filled his world with joy. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park, Ryan turned to Grace. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "Together. I'm going to make sure you're safe and happy. Grace, that's a promise." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a cautious hope. "You really mean it?" "Absolutely," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I won't let you down." As they stood there, surrounded by the fading light of the day, Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had failed Grace before, but he wouldn't fail her again. This was just the beginning of their journey, and he was ready for whatever lay ahead. For Grace, he would move mountains, confronting shadows. Ryan Turner drove back to his home that evening, his mind heavy with the revelations from Grace. His heart broke for her, but it also burned with determination. Grace's tears at the diner had solidified his resolve. He would confront Laura and ensure Grace's safety, no matter what. He couldn't let her endure one more day of feeling unloved and invisible. As the truck rumbled into his driveway, Grace sat beside him, her head resting against the window, her small frame wrapped in the oversized hoodie he had given her. She looked peaceful but worn, like a soldier who had fought too many battles alone. "Grace, why don't you go inside and get settled?" Ryan said gently as he parked the truck. "I need to make a few calls." Grace nodded and climbed out of the truck, her footsteps light but hesitant as she made her way to the house. Ryan watched her disappear through the front door before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over Laura's name. His finger twitched as he hesitated, the memories of their past arguments swirling in his mind. But this wasn't about him or Laura anymore. It was about Grace. With a deep breath, he hit the call button. The phone rang twice before Laura answered, her voice sharp and impatient. "Ryan, what do you want?" "It's late." "Laura," Ryan began, his voice steady but laced with anger. "We need to talk." "About Grace." "What about her?" Laura's tone was dismissive, as if he had called about a trivial matter. "She told me everything," Ryan said, cutting straight to the point. "How Mark and Tommy treat her, how she's been made to feel like she's in the way. And don't even try to deny it." There was silence on the other end, but Ryan could hear Laura's sharp intake of breath. When she spoke again, her voice was defensive. "Ryan, you don't know what it's like. She's difficult. She doesn't listen, and Mark has been trying to discipline her." "Discipline her?" Ryan's voice rose, his grip tightening on the phone. "You call locking her in the attic and letting her sleep on the floor discipline? Letting your husband's son mock her and take her belongings? That's not discipline, Laura. That's abuse. You don't understand." Laura snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "You've been gone for years, Ryan. You don't get to come back and judge me. I did the best I could." Ryan's anger simmered, but he kept his voice calm, though it was cold. "Your best wasn't enough. Grace is terrified, Laura. She thinks she's unwanted. A child should never feel that way. She deserves better, and I'm going to make sure she gets it." Laura scoffed, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "And what are you going to do? Take her from me? You don't have the right, Ryan. The courts won't side with you." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll fight in court if I have to. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her. I won't let her go back to that house." "You're overreacting," Laura said, though her voice wavered slightly. "She's fine. She's just being dramatic." "She's not fine, Laura," Ryan said firmly. "And you know it. She's scared. She's hurt. And you let it happen." Laura was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "Ryan, I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I I didn't know how to handle her. Ryan felt a pang of sorrow for the woman he had once loved, but his resolve didn't waver. It's not about you or me anymore, Laura. It's about Grace. She needs stability. She needs love. And if you can't give her that, then I will. Laura exhaled sharply. What are you going to do, Ryan? Are you taking her? Yes, Ryan said, his voice unwavering. She's staying with me from now on. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm filing for custody. What? Laura's voice was shrill now, panic creeping in. You can't just take her, Ryan. She's my daughter too. And she's my daughter, Ryan shot back. And I won't stand by and watch her suffer. There was a long silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Laura sighed, her voice quiet but resigned. Fine, but don't think this is over. I'll fight you if I have to. Do what you need to do, Laura, Ryan said, but I'll fight harder. He ended the call before she could respond, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat in the truck for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to calm himself. This was just the beginning, and he knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for Grace, it was worth it. When he stepped into the house, he found Grace sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, and her sketchbook open in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. Everything okay, Dad? She asked softly. Ryan smiled and sat beside her, pulling her into a side hug. Yeah, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. She leaned into him, her small frame fitting perfectly against his side. You promise? Ryan kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with love and determination. I promise, Grace. I'll always fight for you. As they sat together in the quiet living room, Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something that mattered. And he wouldn't stop until Grace had the life she deserved. The battle begins. The morning dawned gray and heavy, a reflection of the turmoil Ryan Turner felt within. As he prepared breakfast in the kitchen, the sound of sizzling eggs and bubbling coffee filled the air. But his mind was elsewhere. Today marked the start of his legal fight for Grace, a fight he knew would be long and grueling, but one he was determined to win. Grace appeared in the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket she had taken from the couch. Her hair was mussed, and her eyes were puffy from the restless night she had endured. Yet, despite her exhaustion, she managed a small smile when she saw him. Morning, Dad, she said softly, sliding into one of the kitchen chairs. Morning, sweetheart, Ryan replied, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. Did you sleep okay? She shrugged, picking at her toast. Better than before. Ryan sat across from her, watching as she nibbled at her breakfast. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the guarded way she moved. Grace was still adjusting, and the wounds of her past weren't going to heal overnight. But he had made a promise to her, and to himself, that he would give her a safe, loving home where she could rebuild. We're going to see a doctor today, Ryan said gently, breaking the silence. Grace's fork paused midair. A doctor? Why? To make sure you're healthy, Ryan explained, keeping his tone casual. It's important, Grace, and it'll help with the case. She set her fork down, her expression wary. The case? You mean, against Mom? Ryan nodded, leaning forward to take her hand. I want to make sure you're safe, Grace. That you don't have to go back to a place where you feel unwanted or hurt. This is part of making that happen. Grace's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. What if the court says I have to go back? They won't, Ryan said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of hope. But it was fleeting, replaced by the shadows of doubt that had taken root over the years. Ryan's chest tightened. He knew he had to fight not just for Grace's custody, but also for her belief in herself and the love she deserved. A few hours later, they arrived at the small pediatric clinic on the edge of town. The waiting room was quiet, the walls painted in calming shades of blue and green. Grace sat beside him, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she stared at the floor. Ryan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Dr. Myers is really nice," he said. "She's just going to ask a few questions and make sure you're okay." Grace nodded, but her posture remained tense. When the nurse called her name, Ryan stood and followed her into the examination room. The doctor, a warm-faced woman in her late 40s, greeted them with a kind smile. "Hi, Grace. I'm Dr. Myers," she said, crouching to Grace's eye level. "I hear you've been through a lot lately. But don't worry, I'm here to help." Grace offered a small nod, her gaze flicking to Ryan for reassurance. He gave her an encouraging smile and a squeeze of her hand. The examination was thorough but gentle. Dr. Myers asked Grace about her eating habits, her sleep patterns, and her overall well-being. Grace answered in soft, hesitant tones, her eyes darting to Ryan occasionally, as if seeking permission to speak. When the physical examination began, Ryan stepped outside, wanting to give Grace some privacy. As he waited in the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming custody battle. He had already spoken to his lawyer, James Reynolds, who had assured him that the doctor's report would be a critical piece of evidence. But Ryan knew it wouldn't be enough. He needed more: testimonies, records, anything that could prove Grace's neglect and abuse. When the door opened, Dr. Myers stepped out, her expression serious. "Mr. Turner, can we talk for a moment?" Ryan's stomach sank. Of course. Dr. Myers led him to her office, where she gestured for him to sit. She closed the door behind them and sat across from him, her hands folded on the desk. "Grace is a remarkable young girl," she began. "But it's clear she's been through a lot. Physically, she shows signs of malnutrition. Nothing severe, but enough to indicate she hasn't been eating regularly or properly. Emotionally, she's guarded, which is common in children who have experienced neglect or trauma." Ryan swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. "What does this mean for the case?" "It means you have evidence to support your claims," Dr. Myers said. "I'll provide a full report detailing my findings. But more importantly, Grace needs stability and support. She's resilient, but she's also vulnerable. The sooner you can secure custody, the better." Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe." Dr. Myers smiled faintly. "She's lucky to have a father who cares so much. Keep fighting for her, Mr. Turner." The drive home was quiet. Grace stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Ryan wanted to say something, to reassure her, but he wasn't sure what words could ease the weight she carried. When they pulled into the driveway, she turned to him. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" Ryan's heart ached at the question. He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not just going to feel normal, Grace. You're going to feel happy, safe, loved. I promise." She offered a small smile, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "Thanks, Dad." As they stepped into the house, Ryan felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for custody. He was fighting for Grace's chance at a brighter future. And he wouldn't stop until she had everything she deserved. The battle was just beginning, but Ryan was ready for the fight. For Grace, he would give everything. The house was quiet as they stepped inside, the air carrying a sense of tentative hope. Grace drifted into the living room, curling up on the couch with her sketchbook. Ryan watched her for a moment, his heart heavy but resolute. He had always admired her ability to lose herself in her art, even in the darkest moments. It was her safe space, and he wasn't going to let anything take that away from her. After ensuring Grace was settled, Ryan walked into the small study he had hastily converted into a makeshift war room for the custody case. The desk was cluttered with legal papers, notes from his lawyer, and a growing list of witnesses who might be willing to testify on Grace's behalf. He sank into the chair, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the mountain of work ahead. The first step, James had told him, was to gather testimonies from people who had observed Grace's treatment or could vouch for his ability to provide her with a stable home. Ryan's thoughts turned to Mrs. Conway, the elderly neighbor who had always been fond of Grace. She had mentioned noticing things over the years: Laura yelling, Grace playing alone outside for hours while the rest of the family stayed indoors. He decided to pay her a visit. A soft knock on Mrs. Conway's door was answered quickly. The elderly woman smiled warmly when she saw Ryan, her weathered face lighting up with recognition. "Ryan. It's been ages," she said, opening the door wider. Come in, come in." "Thanks, Mrs. Conway," Ryan said, stepping inside. The familiar scent of lavender and freshly baked cookies filled the air, a comforting reminder of his childhood. "I was hoping I could talk to you about Grace." Her smile faded slightly, and she gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table. "Of course. I've been worried about that sweet girl for years." Ryan's chest tightened. "What have you noticed?" Mrs. Conway poured them each a cup of tea before sitting down across from him. She sighed heavily, her hands clasping the mug. "It's not my place to interfere, but I've seen things, Ryan. Grace always seemed so lonely, playing by herself in the yard. I'd wave to her, and she'd smile, but it never reached her eyes. And there were days when I'd hear shouting from the house. Laura and that husband of hers." Grace would run outside, sit under the old oak tree, and stay there for hours. Ryan's fists clenched under the table. "Did you ever see anything that could be considered neglect? Or worse?" Mrs. Conway hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I can't say I saw anything outright, but there were signs. Grace's clothes were often too small or worn, and she seemed so thin. Once, she came over with a scraped knee and a bruise on her arm. When I asked what happened, she just shrugged and said, 'It's okay. It doesn't hurt much.' That broke my heart." Ryan swallowed hard, his resolve solidifying. "Would you be willing to testify, to share what you've seen in court?" Mrs. Conway's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to place a hand on his. "Anything for Grace. She deserves better than what she's been through." When Ryan returned home, he found Grace still on the couch, her sketchbook open in her lap. She had drawn a vivid scene of a forest, with sunlight streaming through the trees. It was beautiful, but the figure standing alone in the clearing tugged at his heartstrings. "That's amazing, Grace," he said, sitting beside her. "You've always had such a gift." She looked up at him, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "Thanks, Dad. It's just something I do to relax." Ryan nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "I talked to Mrs. Conway today. She told me she's been worried about you too." Grace's eyes widened slightly, and she set the sketchbook aside. "She did. She did," Ryan confirmed. "She's going to help us. She said she'll tell the court everything she's seen." Grace bit her lip, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "What if it doesn't work? What if they make me go back?" Ryan reached out, taking her hands in his. "I won't let that happen, Grace. I promise. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you're safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want to stay here, with you." "And you will," Ryan said firmly. "No one is taking you away from me." The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Ryan worked tirelessly with James to gather evidence, reaching out to Grace's former teachers, neighbors, and anyone who could provide insight into her life under Laura's care. The pediatrician's report was damning, detailing Grace's malnutrition and the emotional toll evident in her behavior. James assured Ryan that their case was strong, but Ryan knew the courtroom was a battlefield where nothing was guaranteed. Grace began to open up more during their time together. She talked about her dreams of becoming an artist, about the books she loved to read, and even about the small, happy memories she clung to from their time as a family before everything fell apart. Each moment with her felt like a victory, a step toward healing. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace turned to him and said, "Dad, do you think Do you think we can really win? Ryan placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I don't just think it, Grace. I know it. We're going to win because we're fighting for what's right, and no one can take that from us. She leaned into him, her small frame relaxing against his side. I'm glad you came back. I'll always come back for you, he said softly, kissing the top of her head. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight for Grace with everything he had. For her, he would endure any battle, face any challenge, and never, ever give up. The final stand. The day of the custody hearing arrived on a cold, overcast morning. Ryan stood in front of the mirror in his small, modest bathroom, adjusting the tie that felt too tight around his neck. His reflection stared back at him, a mixture of determination and apprehension in his eyes. This was it, the culmination of weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and heartfelt promises to Grace. Today, he would stand in court and fight for her future. As he walked into the living room, Grace was waiting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was dressed in the new outfit they had picked out together, a simple but pretty dress that made her look older than her 12 years. Yet, despite her composed appearance, Ryan could see the nervous energy in the way her feet tapped lightly against the floor. You ready, sweetheart? Ryan asked, his voice soft. Grace looked up at him, her eyes wide but resolute. I think so, she said, standing and smoothing her dress. Are you? Ryan smiled, bending down slightly to look her in the eye. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. He took her hand, and together they walked out to the truck. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Grace. Ryan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, wishing he could take away her fear. He knew this day would be difficult for her, but he also knew it was necessary. The courthouse was an imposing building, its gray stone facade looming against the overcast sky. Ryan parked the truck and helped Grace out, her small hand gripping his tightly. They walked through the heavy wooden doors, the air inside cool and sterile. James Reynolds, Ryan's lawyer, was waiting for them near the courtroom, his sharp suit and calm demeanor a reassuring presence. Ryan, Grace, James said with a nod. Are you ready? As ready as we'll ever be, Ryan replied, squeezing Grace's hand. James crouched slightly to address Grace directly. You're very brave for being here today, Grace. Remember, you don't have to speak unless you want to. Ryan and I will handle everything. Grace nodded, her gaze flicking nervously to her father. Okay. Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder. It's going to be okay. Just stick with me. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the warmth Ryan had tried to create at home. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the air felt heavy with formality. Laura was already seated at the opposing table, her expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Beside her sat Mark, his posture rigid and his eyes avoiding Ryan's gaze. Ryan felt a surge of anger, but quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about them. It was about Grace. The judge, a stern-looking woman with steel-gray hair, entered the room, and everyone rose. As the proceedings began, Ryan felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy cloak. James opened with a compelling argument, outlining the neglect and emotional abuse Grace had endured. He presented the pediatrician's report, Mrs. Conway's testimony, and even letters from Grace's former teachers, all painting a clear picture of a child who had been let down by the people who were supposed to care for her most. Laura's lawyer countered with arguments that Ryan's military career had made him an absentee father, painting Laura as the parent who had held things together in his absence. Ryan clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to lash out. He had anticipated this line of attack, but hearing it aloud still stung. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, he rose and took a deep breath, his eyes briefly meeting Grace's before focusing on the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I may not have been a perfect father, but I've always loved my daughter with everything I have. I served my country because I believed it would create a better world for Grace to grow up in. I never imagined that my time away would be used to tear us apart." He glanced at Laura and Mark, then back at the judge. "Grace deserves a home where she feels safe and loved. A place where she doesn't have to question her worth or wonder if she's wanted. I've seen what she's been through, and I can't let her go back to that." As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, the passion behind his words undeniable. "I'm not asking for custody out of spite or anger. I'm asking because I want to give Grace the life she deserves, the life she hasn't had. I promised her I'd fight for her, and that's what I'm doing." When he sat down, he felt Grace's small hand slip into his, her grip firm despite her trembling fingers. He squeezed her hand, silently reassuring her that they were in this together. The judge called for a short recess, and Ryan took Grace outside to the courthouse steps. The crisp air was a welcome relief after the tension of the courtroom. Grace sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. "Do you think the judge believes you?" she asked, her voice small. Ryan looked at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her eyes. "I think the judge sees the truth, Grace, and the truth is that you deserve better." Grace hesitated, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "I don't want to go back there, Dad." "You won't," Ryan said firmly. "I promise." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Laura had taken the stand, her testimony a mixture of deflection and justification. She painted herself as a mother overwhelmed by circumstance, claiming that Grace's complaints were exaggerated. But the evidence was against her, and it was clear the judge wasn't swayed. Finally, the judge called Grace to speak. Ryan's heart clenched as she stood, her small figure dwarfed by the courtroom's formality. She glanced at him, and he gave her an encouraging nod. Grace's voice was quiet but steady as she addressed the judge. "I just want to be somewhere I feel safe," she said, "with someone who loves me. My dad. He makes me feel that way. He's always made me feel that way." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. When she returned to her seat, Ryan pulled her close, whispering, "You were amazing, Grace." The judge's decision came after what felt like an eternity. When she announced that custody would be awarded to Ryan, the relief was overwhelming. Grace threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face as she clung to him. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We did," Ryan said, holding her tightly. "We're going home." That evening, back at their house, Ryan and Grace sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear night sky. For the first time in years, the weight that had pressed on both of them felt lifted. "Are we really free now?" Grace asked, her voice filled with wonder. "We're free, Grace," Ryan said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And we're going to build something amazing together. The life where you're never scared or alone again." As they sat there, the night enveloping them in its quiet embrace, Ryan felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been won, but the journey was just beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, stronger and more united than ever. For Grace, he had fought with everything he had. And now, they had a future worth fighting for. The next few days after the custody ruling were surreal for Ryan and Grace. The tension that had weighed heavily on their shoulders for so long began to fade, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of peace. Ryan spent his days reorganizing the house, ensuring Grace's room was a place she could call her sanctuary. He brought home shelves for her books, new art supplies, and even a set of twinkling string lights that she had shyly pointed out during a shopping trip. Grace, for her part, began to blossom. The shadows in her eyes seemed to lift little by little, replaced by the light of a child discovering safety and love. She filled the house with her quiet laughter, sketching her dreams on the blank pages of her notebook. Every new smile felt like a victory to Ryan, a sign that they were heading in the right direction. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Grace looked up from her plate. "Dad." "Yeah, sweetheart," Ryan replied, setting his fork down and giving her his full attention. "Do you think it's okay if I start calling this place home?" Her voice was tentative, as if she were afraid to hope. Ryan's chest tightened, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "This is your home, Grace, always. Wherever I am, that's your home too." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Okay." The simplicity of her response hit Ryan like a wave. For so long, she had been searching for a place to feel safe, to feel loved. Now, they were finally building that place together. Weeks turned into months, and life began to take on a new rhythm. Grace started school at a nearby middle school, her nervousness slowly giving way to excitement as she made friends and found her footing. Ryan threw himself into being the father she needed, attending her parent-teacher conferences, cheering her on at her school art shows, and being there for every moment she wanted to share. One evening, as Ryan was cleaning up the dishes, Grace approached him, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "Dad, can I show you something?" she asked, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Of course," Ryan said, drying his hands and sitting beside her on the couch. She opened her sketchbook to a page filled with a vibrant, detailed drawing. It depicted a small, cozy house surrounded by towering oak trees, sunlight streaming through their branches. In front of the house stood two figures, a man and a girl, holding hands, their smiles radiating warmth. "This is us," she said quietly, pointing at the figures. "This is our home." Ryan felt his throat tighten as he took in the image. "It's beautiful, Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." She smiled shyly, leaning against him. "I think I'm finally starting to feel happy, Dad. Like I belong." "You do belong," Ryan said, wrapping an arm around her. "And you always will." As the seasons changed, so did they. The house became filled with memories of movie nights, pancake breakfasts, and lazy Sundays spent exploring the nearby woods. Grace's laughter rang through the halls, her sketches decorating the walls like a gallery of her newfound joy. Ryan took every opportunity to remind her how loved she was, how proud he was of the strength she had shown. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they raked leaves in the yard, Grace paused and looked at Ryan. "Dad?" she called, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Yeah, sweetheart," he replied, leaning on his rake. "Thanks for not giving up on me," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ryan walked over and crouched down so they were eye level. "Grace, I could never give up on you. You're my daughter, my world. I'd fight for you 1,000 times over." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Grace," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Always." Years later, as Grace prepared to graduate high school, Ryan sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride. She had grown into a confident, talented young woman, her love for art now matched by her love for life. When her name was called, and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Ryan stood and cheered, his voice rising above the crowd. After the ceremony, as they celebrated together at home, Grace handed him a small wrapped gift. "What's this?" Ryan asked, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "Open it and see," Grace said, her smile wide. Inside was a framed drawing, one that mirrored the sketch she had shown him years ago. But this one was different. It was more detailed, more vibrant. The house was the same, but now it was surrounded by blooming flowers, and the two figures had been joined by a small happy dog. At the bottom, Grace had written in her elegant script, "Home is where love grows." Ryan's eyes filled with tears as he looked at her. "This is perfect, Grace. Thank you." "It's true," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You gave me a home, Dad, and you taught me what love really means." As they hugged, Ryan felt a profound sense of peace. The journey they had taken together hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle, every fight. Together, they had built a life filled with love, trust, and hope. A life where Grace could thrive. In that moment, as he held his daughter close, Ryan knew they had both found something truly priceless, a home not defined by walls, but by the unbreakable bond they shared.